New English speakers.
Good afternoon. Yeah, it's afternoon. At least in Buffalo it is.
I knew something was missing.
We are going to do the sixth Mishnah, sixth paragraph of the first chapter of Ethics of the Fathers. Now we're going to the next generation. The way Ethics of the Fathers begins is it starts off with how Moses received the Torah from Sinai, and he passed it down to Joshua to the elders to the prophets to the men of the great assembly, and then it starts telling us things that they said. And then it gives you their successors. Shimon HaTzadik was the last generation of the men of the great assembly. His student was Antignos, and then his students, has two now, are Yossi ben Yoezer and Yossi ben Yochanan, and their successors were these two rabbis over here, Yehoshua ben Perachya and Yanai the Arbelite. As I mentioned in previous classes, these two rabbis served as the leaders of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish Supreme Court, which effectively made them the leaders of the Jewish people. Jewish people were governed by Jewish law, and the leaders of the Sanhedrin were the leaders of the Jewish people. In that sense, they were not only the religious leaders, but they also had political influence, sometimes more than others. These two sages, Yehoshua ben Perachya and Rabbi, the first one, Yehoshua, was the Nasi. He was the leader, the head, the president, you could say, of the Supreme Court of the Sanhedrin. And Rabbi was his deputy, who was referred to as the Av Bezdin, the father of the court. The father of the court was more internal. He was more involved in the internal goings-on of the Sanhedrin. The Nasi was more aloof in the sense that he dealt with the outside world, not just with the Sanhedrin. Although he was involved in the Sanhedrin, he was considered to be the greatest the scholar alive at that time. But he functioned not just internally, but also externally. Now, Yehoshua ben Perachya said the following three things. Appoint for yourself a teacher, acquire for yourself a companion, and judge all people with a scale weighted in his favor. It doesn't say men, by the way, in the Hebrew. It says kol ha'adam. But in olden days, when you said something generically about human beings, you used the word men, but it doesn't refer to men. It means all people with a scale weighted in his favor. Judge everyone favorably, in other words. Let me tell you a little bit about Yehoshua ben Perachya. We know a few things about him that will maybe shed some light on some of the things that he said. Number one, as I mentioned before, he was the Nasi. He was the leader of the Jewish people at that time. Number two, at the time that he was the leader, the Jewish people also were governed by the Hasmonean Dynasty. In the class that we had about Hanukkah, the Hasmonean, the Hasmoneans were the heroes of Hanukkah, and as the generations progressed, they assumed more power to the point where they actually became the kings. They were the kings of Israel. One of these kings was a man called Yanai. Now, Yanai was strongly influenced by the Sadducees. The Sadducees were those who broke away from traditional Judaism and rejected the whole oral tradition, rejected a lot of other things as well, and they became more and more prominent, more and more influential, acquiring more and more power, to the point where the Yanai, the descendant of the Hasmonean who fought a bloody war to protect the Jewish people's religion, he became one of them, one of the enemy. He wasn't, I don't think he was called a Hellenist, but he was called a Sadducee, which for all intents and purposes shared many of the heretical beliefs of the Hellenists. So at any rate, Yanai was provoked against the rabbis. It's a whole long story which I won't go into. And he murdered all the rabbis he can get his hands on. And Yehoshua ben Perachya, as the leading rabbi, had to flee, and he fled to Alexandria. And then years later, he was brought back by Yanai's brother-in-law, Shimon ben Shattach, who was his successor. And he was the brother of the queen, Shlom Tzion, who was a very famous, righteous Jewish woman, unlike her husband. At any rate, Yehoshua ben Perachya had that experience in his life. But then there's another story about Yehoshua ben Perachya, a very, very interesting one that was kept somewhat secret. It's mentioned in the Talmud, but it was taken out of the Talmud by printers, or maybe by the Jews themselves, because of how it may provoke the Catholic Church against the Jews. This is a story of someone called Yeshu. Yeshu is identified by many as the founder of the what's the religion? What is it called? Christianity. He was the one that they worship. Now, it doesn't fit in with the dating that the Catholics attribute his existence. So many people say that there were two different people who the whole myth of Christianity is based on. And one of them was called Yeshua, who was a disciple of Yehoshua ben Perachya. Now what happened with him? He started to do things that were contrary to Judaism. He was rebelling against Judaism to the point where Yehoshua ben Perachya threw him out of the academy. He said, "You're not worthy of being a student here." And after a while, Yeshua felt a little bit of remorse, and he came back to be accepted again, and he was sent away. Then he came back a second time, and he was sent away, told, "No, we don't want you here." The third time, Yehoshua ben Perachya decided if he comes back a third time, that shows sincerity and I'll accept him. And yes, if he doesn't accept me now, I'll go out all full force against Judaism. When he came back the third time, Yehoshua ben Perachya was in the middle of his prayers. So he put up his hand like this to say, wait a few minutes. Yeshu took this to mean, stay out. I don't want you here. And he went out full force against Judaism, and he was eventually executed by the Sanhedrin. This was before the Romans were in control of Israel. This is still when the Hasmonean Dynasty was in control. So it's obviously not the same story that they have. That just points to the fact that there were several people that they based their mythology on. And one of them was the Yeshu, who was a student of Yehoshua ben Perachya. That's a very important story that will help us understand some of what Yehoshua ben Perachya has been saying over here. So let's go through the three things. Again, the first thing was appoint for yourself a teacher. The second one is acquire a companion. And the third is to judge all people favorably. These three teachings actually, if you look at the pattern in these three teachings, they apply to how you relate to someone above you, someone alongside of you, your peers, and someone beneath you. When it comes to someone, you always have to have someone above you. You always have to have someone that you look up to. That's the teacher. But then you have to have peers, and you have to know how to relate to them. And then you have to know how to look down, how to look at people who are beneath you and not look down at them. Those are three different levels that this covers. I think also this could relate to the original teaching of Shimon HaTzadik, that the world stands on three pillars: Torah, avoda, service, and acts of kindness. The first teaching relates to Torah. Make yourself for a teacher. Don't think you could learn Torah all on your own. You have to have a teacher. You have to have someone who knows more than you, who can guide you, who can teach you. That's Torah. Now when it comes to avoda, service involves your relationships with God. That's what service is. What is prayer? Prayer is an experience where we have a relationship with God. We talk about God and we try to relate to Him. Not just as a creator, but someone who is close to us. And acquiring a colleague is a way to do it, because when a person has emotional issues, what is the best approach to dealing with them? Yes, sure, certain people have to go to a therapist. Certain people need to take medication. That's all true. Some people have to go to a teacher, but the most effective way of dealing with your nature, your emotions, is to have someone who was close to you, a real friend. I told the story several times before, I think, that someone came to the Rebbe and said to the Rebbe, how is it that people adore you so much? Why do they love you so much? Why are they so passionate about you? So the Rebbe answered, I try to be a good friend. And he said, good friend? What's the big deal about that? The Rebbe says, how many good friends do you have? Oh, I have plenty. And the Rebbe then defined what a good friend is. A good friend is someone who feels your pain, who rejoices in your joy, who doesn't judge you. The way after the Rebbe finished describing what a good friend is, he says, how many good friends do you have? I don't know if he had even one. A really good friend who you share your life with, and who could feel everything that you're feeling and could relate to you and counsel you. That's the second pillar of avoda, of service to God, which is called avoda shebelev, the service of the heart. Your colleague, your peer, is not just someone you exchange ideas with, but someone who could relate to you. There's a saying of one of the Chabad Rebbes, the Mitteler Rebbe, the second Rebbe, whose anniversary of his birth and his passing we celebrated last week. The day he was released from prison was a day later. And he once said that when two Jews get together to discuss their spiritual lives, it's two godly souls against one animal soul. How does that work? When you are in a spiritual mode and you're trying to become a better person, a more spiritual person, a more godly person, your godly soul is certainly behind you. When you're talking to another person about their situation, your godly soul is also behind, because your godly soul cares about the other no less than it cares about yourself. So if I have a problem, an emotional issue, I have a spiritual issue, my godly soul is supporting me, and your godly soul, if you're my friend, is supporting me. My animal soul is selfish. My animal soul only thinks about me, doesn't think about the other. So my animal soul is not trying to trip up the other. It's only trying to mess me up, that I should act like an animal. Your animal soul is not interested in me. It's interested only in you. So each one of us has two godly souls operating against each other's one's own animal soul. It's one for the other. So when you share your emotional issues, when you share your spiritual problems and challenges with another who cares for you, which is the main point over here, then you have it made. You have much more power to deal with your issues than you would have if you deal with it yourself. Because if you deal with it yourself, it's one. And sometimes the godly soul is more powerful, sometimes the animal soul is more powerful. But when it's two people who are sharing their feelings and are so close to each other, like we had in the story in the Tanakh with David and Jonathan, their love for each other, their care for each other was indescribable in several ways. And this is another example of how Hebrew has so much in it, and each word is pregnant with so many different meanings that you don't get in the English unless you go through all the translations, and that would be impossible to read. The Hebrew word aseh could mean make. They translate it as a point. It's not wrong. But it also has the meaning of compel, coerce, twist their arm. When someone needs a teacher, and you come to the person and says, I need a teacher, could you be my teacher? The person...
When you go to the heavenly court, one passes from the body, that you're presented as
You can ask Google. Yeah, you can ask Google.